Hey, good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us on our second session of the Word on the Street Wall reading series. Tonight, we are welcoming author Janie Chang, the author of The Library of Legends. Before we begin, we'd like to do a land acknowledgement. The Lethbridge Public Library acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pay respect to the Blackfoot people, past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The city of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. As I mentioned, tonight's author is Janie Chang. Janie writes historical fiction with a personal connection, drawing from a family history with 36 generations of recorded genealogy. She grew up listening to stories about life in a small Chinese town in the years before the Second World War and tales of ancestors who encountered dragons, ghosts, and immortals. Her first novel, Three Souls, was a finalist for the 2014 BC Book Prize's Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize, and her second novel, Dragon Springs Road, was a Globe and Mail national bestseller. Both were nominated for the International Dublin Literary Award, and her third book, The Library of Legends, which we'll be discussing tonight, is a Globe and Mail national bestseller. Janie is a graduate of the Writers Studio at Simon Fraser University and a proud member of Tall Poppy Writers, a tribe of authors with a mission to connect readers with great books while supporting some good causes. She is also the founder and main organizer of Canadian Authors for Indies, a national day of support by authors for independent bookstores, which ran from 2015 to 2017, and the event is now run as Canadian Independent Bookstore Day by the Retail Council of Canada. Born in Taiwan, Janie has lived in the Philippines, Iran, Thailand, and New Zealand, and now lives in beautiful Vancouver, Canada. Welcome, Janie.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you. So I just read your Library of Legends just in the past couple of weeks here, and I have to say, just as we start out, it was a wonderful book, very interesting. And for those people who haven't had a chance to read your novel yet, can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yes, the Library of Legends is set in 1937, which is the start of the Japanese invasion of China, and it follows a group of university students who must evacuate their campus to get to the safety of China's interior, away from the war zones. And the main character is a young woman named Lian. She's one of the students. And she and her classmates and professors and staff must walk 1,000 miles to safety. And they carry with them a priceless library known as, well, a priceless collection of books known as the Library of Legends. And they feel that it's really important to keep these books safe because it's legacy, it's knowledge through the war. But as they travel through China, the spirit guardians and supernatural creatures described in the Library of Legends start coming to life. And there's another exodus in parallel with the students. And Leanne starts becoming closer friends with her classmates, but a family secret catches up with her, one that makes her turn away from her classmates and perhaps a new romance. And things come to a head when one of her classmates is murdered. And I'm not going to say any more because then it's spoiler territory.
Yep. No, I think that's a good summary of the first part of the book. And I know that in the marketing and for the book, it's sort of, when I was looking at ordering the book, it's described as historical fiction.
Yes.
But to me, it sort of transcends that label of just the historical fiction genre.
Mm-hmm.
There's really elements of romance, sort of mystery when you talk about the murder of Leanne's classmate. How do you feel that it just sort of fits into the historical fiction genre, or do you think, how would you describe the genre that it fits into? It's a fantasy element there, and
I consider it historical fiction because apart from the supernatural stuff, it is historically accurate, apart from the spirit creatures. And I don't know what happens. I start out with all the good intentions of writing straight historical fiction, but then the supernatural just kind of noses its way in. And that's what happens. But when I do employ the supernatural, the metaphysical, I make sure that it is consistent with the setting of the novel. So I don't like to invent something that isn't already a feature of Chinese folklore and mythology. So I feel that whatever is supernatural in there has to be something that would have been familiar to the students. For example, it would have been folk tales that they already knew about. It would be consistent with the setting of the novel.
Okay, interesting. So in writing historical fiction, how do you approach finding the sort of the right balance between the history aspect of the novel and the fiction aspect? Do you do a lot of research then and sort of
Oh, well, research is such an issue for those of us who write historical fiction, because for one thing, we wouldn't be writing historical fiction if we weren't kind of history nerds to begin with. So one of the biggest problems is knowing when to stop, because there are so many interesting rabbit holes that you could just fall into, and you could research forever, and you could keep deluding yourself that you're doing productive work, and actually you haven't written a single word yet of your novel. So I try not to spend more than about 6 months off and on doing the research, while also thinking through the plot of the story and letting the plot of the story direct and focus and sort of narrow the parameters of the research. And then in terms of how I use that information, I always think of historical facts as like the boundaries or the frame, and that defines the parameters of the story itself. So you try to fit your fiction within the bounds of historical accuracy. Yeah.
makes sense. You mentioned going down some of the rabbit holes in your research. Was there anything you found when you were researching the Library of Legends that sort of surprised you, or that was you didn't know about before that was really interesting?
There's always something that throws you for a loop, and you have to pay attention, because it could really change your story or change the way you think about a character. And for me, the really big thing was the Library of Legends itself, because when I first sent in the synopsis of the story to my editors, it was going to be about the exodus or the evacuation of a campus of university students to safety. And I thought it was a pretty good story because it's based on my father's own experiences in university during the war. So there I was researching and came across the memoirs of some of the alumni of a particular university. And they just kind of mentioned in the prologue that they had brought with them, like 230 crates of books from the provincial library, and that these were books, 300-year-old books, an encyclopedia of Chinese literature. And they carried these to safety, even though it endangered them because they had to travel a lot more slowly, right? Carrying all this stuff. And right away, I knew that this had to be a feature of the novel. Not only that, but it's a library. What a metaphor you have there. It's like this gift dropped in your lap when you're an author, because a library carries so much meaning. It's knowledge, it's culture, it's legacy, it's love of learning. It's all of those things.
Yeah. Where did your inspiration for the Library of Legends come from? Was there something that drew you to this particular time period?
I think it's because it dawned on me one day that not a lot of people outside of China know about this particular episode in history, which is the evacuation of Chinese universities. So I've mentioned that my father was one of those students, but actually there were 77 universities that, you know, up and left. They traveled from Eastern China westwards into Central China, walking through war zones when they couldn't get transportation. And it was just an amazing story. It was like the largest mass migration of academics in history, and nobody outside of China knew anything about it. And so I really wanted to shine a light on this extraordinary effort, and of course on the rescue of the library by one of these universities. And also, you know, fiction thrives on conflict. So if you want, so I wanted to pick a time of great conflict. It was a war. There was a war going on. There was social upheaval. There was political upheaval. You know, there was so much to pick from if there's conflict. So
Yeah, it was really inspiring to hear about all the different universities evacuating. And I think there was a part where they mentioned that the students were sort of the future of of China and how important it was to protect them. And I really found that sort of inspiring. I've never heard of anything sort of trying to protect that sort of intellectual value and the culture and everything and trying to evacuate everyone like that. It was very interesting.
yes, because at the time, um, China had a population of about half a billion, 500 million people. But of these, I mean, literally, there were 43,000 university students. Such a tiny, tiny percentage.
Yeah.
And both political parties, the nationalist government and the communists who were not in power, they really wanted to preserve this next generation of young people, of educated young people who would be the ones building a future China. So, you know, both parties were invested in saving these students. So.
Yeah. It was interesting. I from that time period, like the late 1930s, most of my what I've learned in school and my own knowledge is more of a Western perspective. We learned about the events going on in Europe and what led up to World War II. So it was very interesting to hear about the Indochina War here. And did you find that with a lot of your, have you heard a lot of comments from readers that they didn't know much about this period or?
Well, first of all, Jonathan, I don't want you to feel bad because honestly, the most Chinese history I've learned has been over the last 10 years when I started writing historical fiction set in China. Because I mean, I went through a Western school system and no, you know, there wasn't a lot of Asian history that was taught. I do find what's the most gratifying is when I get email from readers who say, you know, my ancestry is Chinese, but I never knew very much about the history of my parents' culture or my grandparents who came to Canada. Um, and I'm learning about this for the first time. And to me, that's really gratifying. And I get lots of email too from people who say, wow, in the West, we just learn about D-Day or Dieppe or, you know, things like that, but we never learn about what's going on in Asia. And there were two world wars, you know, world wars. Um, so I'm hoping that maybe Chinese history will get more attention from Hollywood. And also, I think, you know, this right now, it's a time in our history where the presence of China is very, very, you know, visible. And I think it behooves people to understand what has happened in the past, to see, you know, to understand a little bit more about the path that brought the Chinese government to where it is now.
Well, I think it's very important, sort of knowing the history of where people came from and what shaped their views and their culture and everything. It goes a
Mhm.
long way to instead of making you able to understand where they're coming from now.
Yes, you don't have to condone it, but it's good to understand it.
Exactly. So you mentioned that some of the events in the novel are sort of influenced by your
Oops, sorry.
father's past and based on family stories. How has your family reacted to the novel? Do they recognize some of the events, and do they feel that you portrayed them the way that you've learned they've taught you or told you the stories?
Well, both my parents are gone, so yeah, so they have not had a chance to read my novels. But my what happened was I got my dad to talk into a tape recorder many, many years ago, and he sort of told me some of the family stories. And I actually did self-publish the stories in a book as a gift one year to all of my friends and relatives. And
Amazing.
they're actually, yeah, so they're actually up on my blog now because I thought I would share them with readers because you can read through those family stories and you can identify them in the novels as well. I thought that would be fun for people. Um,
Yeah.
so, and all I can say is that I'm really grateful to have those stories because I think they're a way for me to um, honor my ancestors, but also by bringing them into the novels, I think they add, authenticity and richness of detail. So,
Oh, definitely. Um, in the novel, you mention a number of different myths and legends. What are some of your favorite or most comforting myths, and why do you think we cling to these myths and family stories in our times of struggle?
oh gosh, I think my one of my favorite stories is actually there's a very, very famous one in Chinese mythology. It's called The Story of the Ox Herd and the Heavenly Weaving Maid. And in all cultures, you have stories of gods coming down and falling in love with mortals, right? Like Greek mythology, just everywhere it happens. And in this particular case, it's the Heavenly Weaving Maid, who was one of the stars in the heavens. And she comes down, meets this handsome young ox herd. They fall in love, but she's not allowed to stay on Earth and she has to go back up to the heavens. But once a year, the Queen Mother of Heaven allows her and her lover to meet across the bridge of birds when all the birds of Earth fly up and create a bridge, and that's where they meet. And this has since been marketed as Chinese Valentine's. So, like, what can you do about that? um, and that is the basis for the folktale that I've made up in the Library of Legends, the story of the Willow Star and the Prince. I think that why do all of these folk tales and mythology, why do they resonate so much with us? Possibly because we hear about them when we're children, and when we're children, stories make a very deep impression on us and we remember them all the time. Possibly because there's generally a moral associated with it, and those morals reflect cultural priorities and values. And so they are given to us, served to us as mythology. And yeah,
Okay.
I really do believe that the mythology of a culture says a lot about who we are.
Yeah, I think that the mythology and the cultural stories, they play a very important part in our societies. They sort of, like you said, they pass on those values. Just it's sort of a nice way of sharing those information with our younger generation, so that information keeps getting passed on
Mhm.
younger and younger generations as we go along.
And I also think that in a more micro environment, it's so important to preserve our family stories too, which is one of the reasons why I documented my father's stories, because, after he passed on, his grandchildren never had the chance that I had to listen to those stories, to hear his voice telling me those stories. And I always encourage readers to do what they can to preserve their own oral history, to preserve them, to somehow document them, because oral history is so ephemeral. All it takes is for someone to die and those stories are gone. My mother had dementia for the last 10 years of her life. So, so you have something like that happen in the family and those stories are gone. And, when you're younger and you're trying to get your own career going, you're, raising a family, it might not seem as important, but somehow when you get older, it feels really important to know where you came from and to be able to tell the younger generation where they came from.
Yeah. My mother and I always joke, my great grandmother used to tell us stories from her past and her childhood all throughout, over and over, and we never actually recorded any of them. And now we remember the stories, but I keep telling my mother we need to write them down somewhere, or since we don't have a recording or anything, so the family stories don't get lost.
Oh,
And
yes.
I had a health scare just last year, and it really made me think that this needs to become a priority so that these stories are saved somewhere, so they're not forgotten.
You don't have to write them down. I had my dad talk into a tape recorder because that was the easiest thing
Yeah,
for him, right?
yeah, it's true. We could just record ourselves talking about them as well. I hadn't thought of that. It would save me having to write a lot.
Exactly. I know. Just make it as frictionless as possible.
Yes. Let's see. So, like the political and social landscape in the Library of Legends, there's a lot of change, controversy, and fear in the world right now. What do you think we could learn from this time period in the novel, and what lessons do you think that your novel can impart for people today?
The thing about the students is they're traveling through a war zone. They're seeing, they're meeting up with refugees who've just lost everything. They're refugees in their own country. But I think they move with a sense of purpose and hope. And the library that they carry with them, that is their past and the legacy. So I think it is, from the letters I've had from readers, they see it as a message of having purpose, of having hope, to, despite uncertainty, to remember that there are things that have happened in our past that have been terrible and tempestuous, and somehow we've still managed to survive. I think there's the larger landscape of thousands of years of Chinese history. There have been terrible disasters, worse than what we see now.
Mhm.
Sometimes I try and think, what good does it do me to have, books of genealogy going back 36 generations? And what I think about is some of those people must have survived terrible, terrible times that we could not even imagine. And yet here I am, my brothers are here, we are the descendants. So they survived and thrived, or not.
Exactly. We're running at about 25 minutes past the hour. So what I think we'll do now is I'll turn things over to you to do I understand you have a reading for us, a selection from the Library of Legends. I want to make sure that we get that in and we don't run out of time for that, because it's a wonderful book, like I said, and I think everyone's going to enjoy your reading. And after that, we will turn to some audience questions, and I have a few more questions as well. So I will turn over to you.
Okay. I'm going to read from a scene that's, like a few chapters in few chapters into the book. And in this scene, the students are now on the road, which they're sharing with other refugees. They're traveling in a caravan of carts and wheelbarrows. They're carrying their own belongings on their backs. And but even though they're heading towards safety, enemy planes are an ever-present danger. The main character is Lian, and the students right now can hear a plane coming toward them. And I picked this section to read because the very last paragraph was a true event. And when someone told me about that event, the hairs just stood up on the back of my neck, and I thought, I have to write this book. And so that's what I want to share with you. Lian raced for the fields, rucksack bouncing on her back, frozen feet slipping down the embankment. She fell face down, hard-packed earth slamming the breath out of her. "Here, let me help you up," a man's voice said. Still gasping for air, Lian looked up. Shao smiled down at her. Behind him, the servant Sparrow Chen scanned the sky, one's hand shading her eyes as she squinted toward the horizon. Shao pulled Lian to her feet and practically lifted her into the field. He set her down beside an irrigation ditch. Dry stems of wheat prickled her backside and stabbed at her hands. "We'll be safe here," Sparrow said. She had a quiet voice, but Lian heard it very clearly despite the approaching rumble. It was sweetly pitched and cut through the ominous roar. It was the voice of someone Lian felt she could trust. "Into the ditch, please," Shao said, as calmly as if they were entering a classroom. Obediently, she rolled into the trench. Other students were already crouched in the ditch. They all sat with knees tucked, faces turned to the sky. Shao flashed Lian his bright smile again. She stifled a gulp and told herself her heart was racing because of the advancing Japanese airplane. Even though his uniform was covered in dust, it was evident that Shao's jacket was beautifully tailored. Cuffs of fine, cream-colored wool cloth peeked out from the jacket sleeves. He radiated wealth and confidence, as if he were only sitting in the trench to keep her company, as if tragedy had never touched him and never would. Everyone had fallen silent, as if they could hide behind silence. The reverberating drone had turned into a roar. Lian squeezed her eyes shut at the sharp, rapid reports that could have been strings of firecrackers going off, but these were not the cheerful, percussive snaps heard on the streets during New Year festivities. Then it stopped. The roar of engines faded slowly, too slowly, and then the skies were quiet. Lian opened her eyes as voices called out, the shouts of families trying to find each other. "Thank you for getting me off the road," she said, turning to Shao and Sparrow. But Shao was already out of the ditch, jogging across the field toward the road. Sparrow had also climbed up and put a hand down to help Lian. She was slightly shorter, slightly thinner than Lian. In that moment, her eyes bright, cheeks flushed pink from excitement, Sparrow looked almost pretty. Lian wondered if anyone ever looked past the servant to see the girl. Did Shao ever look? Sparrow scrambled up the embankment and onto the road. She bent down to help an old woman collect food that had fallen out of a basket. And for a moment, instead of Sparrow's waifish features, Lian saw an exquisitely beautiful young woman, a woman whose figure gleamed with a faint and barely perceptible glow. Something prickled at the back of Lian's memory, something from a dream. Then the layer of cloud in the sky shifted, and sunrise once again flooded the landscape. Lian blinked and all she saw was Sparrow, a perfectly ordinary servant girl who was running as if something terrible had happened. The road beyond the last cart was pockmarked with bullet holes. The small stone bridge they'd crossed had been straight. Students stood in a circle, some staring down, others looking away. Gaps between their legs revealed a figure lying still on the ground, a dark blue uniform, tunic and trousers, black shoes, a smear of blood. Before Lian could get much closer, someone stepped in front of her. "You don't need to see this," Xiao said, gripping Lian's shoulder. "It's Mr. Shen. He's dead. Their teaching assistant." The victims they had seen on the road a few hours ago had been nameless and faceless, but now the dead had a name. Shen had been one of their own. The circle of students parted as Professor Kang arrived, bringing with him two of the university's laborers. The men wrapped Shen's body in a tarp, then lifted the bundle onto a hand cart. They began pushing it up the road to join the caravan, which was now moving slowly. The professor said something to Sparrow, who had been standing to one side, not joining in, not moving. She nodded and walked away. Sparrow looked shaken, but then so were they all. "We will be at the monastery very soon," Professor Kang said. "I will ask the monks to look after the burial." Sparrow returned, carrying a small chalkboard with ropes looped through holes at the corners. Professor Kang knelt on the ground to write on the chalkboard, his strokes quick and precise, lines from a poem. "Though rainfall bends the river grass, a bird is singing. While ghosts of the 6 dynasties pass like a dream around the forbidden city, under weeping willows which loom for 3 miles along the misty moat." The professor stood up. "Those lines are from a Nanking landscape by the Tang Dynasty poet Wei Zhuang," he said. "Learn it by heart and consider its meaning. And when you write your essays, remember the politics of his time." He put his arms through the ropes and shouldered the chalkboard. They continued their journey, the elderly professor walking in front of his students, the day's lesson hanging down his back.
That was a beautiful scene. When I read that, when I was reading the book, it had such an impact. It's the first sort of the scene that I think where you sort of see the impact that the war is really having, and it becomes really real for the students. But at the same time, it's juxtaposed with the dedication that the professors and the students have to continuing their education and to learn. And it had I felt it was a sort of a visceral reaction to it, to see that dedication. And I couldn't help but wonder if in today's times, if our students would have that same dedication and to take the burden of these books to protect the Library of Legends. I'd like to think so, and I hope so.
Well, I did have a friend say to me when she read it, she said that, she had been, trying to homeschool her kids throughout the pandemic, but at least she wasn't having to walk them through a war zone while doing it. And I just really want to let you know that it wasn't just university students, because in those days, some of the smaller cities did not have very good middle schools.
Okay.
So there were a lot of kids from good families who would go away to boarding school
Okay.
to get once they were past elementary school. And when the war happened, they were separated from their families. They could not get back to their families. So there were also teachers walking their kids to safety, walking like 14-year-olds to safety during a time of war. And that particular scene of the professor carrying the chalkboard on his back and all his students behind him, reading the day's lessons as they walked. It was when a friend of mine told me about this, because he'd also been reading up on this episode of history. Like I said, it just made the hairs on my neck stand up. It was just so emblematic of the Chinese reverence for education. I mean, something that has very much shaped Chinese culture for thousands of years. And that was the moment when I knew I just had to write this book.
Oh, that's an amazing scene. For our audience, you do have the opportunity, if you'd like to ask some questions of Janie, we have the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. You can just type in your question there and I'll read it out. We do have the video and audio turned off for our audience, but I will read out all your questions. And it looks like we do have a few already. We have Caroline was asking if she was wondering if you were inspired by any particular myths or fairy tales when writing your book.
Sorry, can you repeat that? I just had to unplug my phone so that we wouldn't get the landline ringing again. I'm really sorry about that earlier.
I didn't even hear it earlier, so
Okay.
no worries. Caroline was asking, she was wondering if you were inspired by any particular myth or folktale when writing your book.
I wasn't actually going to put any mythology in there. Like my American editor is always saying, Janie, can you please just write straight historical fiction? Because, you know, when you cross genres, it makes it kind of hard to do the marketing. So I did try, but like I said, when I read about this library that had been saved by one of the universities, and then it sort of morphed into the Library of Legends, that's when all the different myths and spirit creatures came in. And in terms of bringing characters from the myths into the story of the novel, I was inspired by the story of the ox herd and the heavenly weaving maid. I mean, but there were so many others to choose from, but this was the one where beings from the heavens had some interaction with the mortal world. So in a way, it was convenient, and in another way, it was an interesting love story. Like, what do you do when you have all of eternity to make the relationship work out?
I have to say, ignore your editor. I loved the sort of mythology part that came into it, and I found that Sparrow was one of my sort of her perspective on things, and she really enjoyed her character in the book. So I don't know. I think it adds something. It sort of adds to that historical aspect, and I really enjoyed it. So
Well, actually, and there was another good thing about adding the scenes with spirit guardians, which was that war is pretty brutal, you know. It was actually really, really depressing doing the research about war because so much horrible stuff happened. There was so much suffering and there was so much cruelty on all sides, and you know, so much loss. And you can't sugarcoat that, right? If you want to honor the actual history, you have to portray it. But you also don't want to turn off people, because if it's too horrible, people will just stop reading. So I think that by using the scenes of the spirits, I was able to balance it out with something ethereal and beautiful and otherworldly. And that gave people a break from the brutality of war.
yeah, provides a nice balance, sort of to ease that off a little bit. You're right. Another question we had was, you described that the Library of Legends is based on a real collection of books, sort of an encyclopedia. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. And Jonathan, maybe I could also send you a link afterwards, because I wrote an article for Time magazine about the actual library that was saved during the war. So I'll give you the short version of it. So about 300 years ago, one of the Qing dynasty emperors he commissioned an encyclopedia of Chinese literature, and he wanted it to, to show off Chinese knowledge and culture. And when this happened, it took about 10 years, 400 scholars, and 7 copies were made, handwritten copies were made. And the emperor had 7 libraries built specifically to house these 7 copies. So 4 of them were in the imperial palaces for his own use, and 3 of them were in various cities. One of the cities was Hangzhou in the province of Zhejiang, and this was known as the Wenlange Library. When the war started, and the universities were packing up and getting ready to leave, the librarian, the chief librarian of the provincial library of Zhejiang, asked the chancellor of the university if they could take the books with them to safety. So they agreed. And unlike the Library of Legends, which I think in my novel is 147 books, these were like 3,000 books, 230 crates of books. And the librarian, the chief librarian, tried to get the Ministry of Education to fund the transportation of this, but he couldn't. And so he borrowed money from friends and family. And eventually, by the end of the war, he had sold his own house to fund transportation. And whenever they could, they tried to transport these by truck, by rail, by ship. When they didn't have it, they would load them onto carts and wheelbarrows and hire laborers to carry, to push them through the next leg of the journey. Sometimes they would, try and carry some in their backpacks. At one point, one of the wheelbarrows overturned, and these, like a crate full of books fell into the river. And so they had to make a stop at the next town and spread them out in the courtyard of one of the temples to dry. And eventually, after 2 years of travel, this university ended up in its wartime campus. Because what happened was the government was building interim campuses in the interior of China so that these students had a place to go. And in the meantime, they were stopping here for a few weeks or a few months whenever they could, and then moving on, because the war just kept moving closer and closer. But even then, they didn't feel that this town where the campus was safe enough. And the library was hidden in some caves outside in this province called Guilin. So they were hidden there in crates. 2 of the university staff stayed there as caretakers, took the books out every year to dry them out to make sure they were okay. And they survived the trip, they survived the war, and went back to the provincial library at the end of the war. And the coda to all of this is in the 1990s, one of the professors from that university went to Kyoto, to Japan, to do some research. And he came across a little snippet of a report that said that when the Japanese took over Shanghai during the Second World War, they had sent agents to Hangzhou to try and get hold of the Wenlange Library, because the Japanese at that time were very interested in acquiring Chinese antiquities. But of course, by then, the library was gone. It had been transported away at the beginning of the war. So that is the true story of events. The library itself, without all the other stuff, it's an epic. Yeah, and nobody knows about it. Nobody knows about the evacuation of universities, and even fewer people know about this amazing library. So I will send you the link afterwards, and you can post it for anybody who wants to read the article in Time magazine.
Excellent, thank you. Sounds like an amazing story. The dedication there, I just unbelievable. And
for those of us who love books, you know.
We have another audience question. Lorraine says that she's loved all of your books and she wants to start writing. What do you think is the most important first step in writing a first book?
Oh, I'm not sure where various people are in their experience in writing. I did a lot of writing in my job, which was in marketing communications, but you know, it's a completely different set of skills when you need to craft a novel, because you've got the arc, you've got the subplots, you've got character development, you've got pacing. And I would say that for me, to shortcut the learning process, the best thing I ever did was to sign up for a one-year program at Simon Fraser, the Writer's Studio, because within that year, I learned about the craft of writing. I got workshopped a lot because you need to have others read your book. You read your writing, you can never be that objective. But I think the main thing is to just write, because when you know, and develop the habit of writing every day, you might write stuff that you think looks like complete crap, but you know what? There's editing. You think that writing is the whole story. It's not. Like, editing is 3/4 of the story. The editing is where the magic happens. You know, it's where you make the story better. It's where you keep all the, you know, get all the elements working properly. It's where you set the proper structure that showcases your story best. So if you can take a course to shortcut all the learning, you know, instead of learning on your own, write every day, you know, work towards your story. You should also read voraciously, because then you will have an idea of what a good story is all about, and maybe read it, analyzing it a little bit more, you know, analyze and say, how does this character change? How does their personality and perceptions and attitudes change from the beginning to the end? That sort of thing.
I wanted to ask you a question sort of about your journey as a writer. I read that you have a degree in computer science. Correct me if I'm.
Yes.
How did you get from computer science to end up being a writer? It just seems so different fields. That what led you down this?
Yeah, I know. Well, I always wanted to write, but I also wanted to be financially independent. I just knew that writing wasn't going to do it for me. So, and fortunately, you know, I was able to get through a course in computing science. But even then, once I got into the world of technology, I was able to eventually kind of switch from the straight systems engineering to technical marketing and you know, writing about technical stuff. I wrote user manuals, I wrote articles, I wrote blog posts. I described it as translating from geek into business English. But at some point, you just decide that you have to. You just, you know, you're just so unhappy for not being able to do what you really want to do. And I think for women especially, we push what we really want to the back burner. And so that's why I say that taking the Writer's Studio at Simon Fraser was the best thing I ever did for myself, because first of all, you had to pay money to get in. And once you've spent money on a course, you know, you sort of give yourself permission to work on that course and get your money's worth out of it. And the learning. The other thing was I've mentioned that my mother had dementia for the last 10 years of her life.
Mhm.
And when I used to go to the care home to visit her, I would see all these people and I would wonder how many of them had dreams that they never managed to fulfill. And I was thinking, boy, I better get my butt in gear and do something about this. And that's when I signed up for a creative writing class. And I was really, really motivated to, to get published, right?
Mhm.
Because at the very least, I wanted to be able to sit in my rocking chair, when I was 95 and say, at least I tried, you know. This is actually, that is so funny that you mentioned that because I've been cleaning out my desk and I have here like the graduation program from 2011, which was the year I took the writing course. And there's like little bios of all the students that we submitted ourselves, and everybody else had, so many other people have like 5 or 6 or 7 lines for what they're doing. And mine is, Janie's goal this year is to complete a first draft of her novel by the end of 2011. Please note that all deadlines, guilt, and stress related to this endeavor are self-inflicted. And it's still true. Like I'm working on my 4th novel right now, and like 2 or 3 times a week, I go through insecurity. I'm absolutely positive that this is the worst thing I've ever written, that it's going to end my writing career. So it never ends.
So, we have another question from the audience here. They were just wondering about your writing process. How do you plan and then write such a vivid, rich story? And how do you keep it all straight in your head? And they just added that they love your books.
Thank you so much. I wish I could say that I had a stable process, but this is only my 4th book that I'm working on. And with every book, it's a different process because I'm always trying to improve. I'm trying to improve the writing. I'm trying to improve the efficiency. I'm trying to improve the plotting. I think with my first novel, it was kind of I was pantsing along. It was very organic. It was being workshopped by my classmates, and you could take your time, sort of, because you weren't under contract. But what I'm trying to do now is write a synopsis and make it more detailed for 2 reasons. One, because I have to. I have to submit a synopsis to my editors, and if they like it, they'll buy the book and I will be under contract. And second of all, I'm under contract, so I need to be more efficient and hit my deadlines. So now I'm not as good as some people who, I guess, have a chapter by chapter sort of a breakdown. I have about 7 pages worth of synopsis. And I write every day. I write 6 days a week. I try and get 500 to 1,000 words in. Every so often, you don't get your 500 words in because there's something else that you need to research. There's something else that has come up, or your plot comes to a screeching halt when you realize something's not going to work. I'm not sure that I have a stable process yet. I've heard of amazing, amazing authors who start on page 1 and write to page 600, and that's that. And they probably go back and edit, but that's not me. I've tried writing the pivotal scenes and then stitching them all together. I've tried writing from start to finish chronologically. Still working on it. Ask me when I'm on my 9th book.
Have you found that the current sort of pandemic situation, has it influenced your writing, how you write, and like your writing process?
Oh, every one of my author friends is having a hard time focusing.
Mhm.
It's just so hard. It's a shitstorm out there, right? And it just feels like you're spending so much of your brain's bandwidth trying to keep all of that at bay so that you're the rest of your brain can work on the creative side, but it is just so hard to focus on any one thing, you know? And I think that is actually one of the reasons why I gave myself a very aggressive deadline so that I'd be under pressure, something even more scary than the world, hitting my deadlines, and hopefully be able to focus that way. Yeah, I think, but then, you know, the pandemic also in some ways doesn't affect me as much as it affects other people, because being a writer, it's a pretty solitary existence. I mean,
Right.
I was already working from home in my home office, and not, you know, I'm not like other people who have to deal with working outside the home with children to deal with. And I think for writers, maybe it hasn't been as bad in terms of the daily routine, though
Mhm.
of course, you know, mentally and emotionally, there's, yeah, it affects us too.
Yeah, there's that strain on everyone, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't know if it's creeping into the writing, if it's filtering through more, I don't know, more pessimism into the scenario of the story. But then, you know, my story is set in World War I, so again, another war.
Oh,
It's not going to be a happy time.
well, exactly. There's going to be pessimism there, regardless.
Yeah, yeah, pretty much.
What can you tell us about your new book? Are you able to share much about it right
Yeah,
now?
I can tell you a little bit about it. So you may have noticed that, not maybe not a mission, but I'm interested in exploring episodes in Chinese history that people don't know very much about, because I didn't know very much about them either. And this has to do with the Chinese Labor Corps. People don't know that during the First World War, deployed throughout the Western Front, there were 140,000 Chinese workers, not soldiers, workers. And this was because after the Battle of the Somme and Verdun, Europe basically ran out of men, you know, and war isn't just about soldiers. War is also about keeping the supply lines going, digging those trenches, mending those roads that get bombed, you know, keeping the railways running, keeping the factories going. And the British and the French went to China and they recruited more than 100,000 men to go to France and to do that work.
Sounds like it'll be
And
interesting.
it's only been in the last 10 years that these workers have received any recognition for their role. Uh, I mean, basically, every Chinese worker who was there freed up a Frenchman or an Englishman to be a soldier. You know? And I just thought this was so interesting because I've never heard of it before.
Hmm. Do you know when does it have a publication date set already, or?
No, I have to turn in my manuscript in the summer
Okay.
of 2021. And once I turn in the manuscript and it gets edited and so on, that's when my publisher will actually commit to a publication date.
Right. Okay. I'm looking forward to seeing it.
Oh, I'm looking forward to finishing it, to writing it, to getting through it.
One last thing I was going to ask you about was if you could tell us a little bit about the Canadian Authors for Indies and about the importance of supporting your indie booksellers.
Well, this is now something that is being run by the Retail Council of Canada,
Yeah.
but I don't know what they've done about this recently. It was, all I can say is that for the 3 years I was running it, it was a lot of work. We had more than 120 bookstores signed up to do it, and more than 700 authors going into those bookstores and bringing their friends and family into the stores. And I think that, and Some of the stores did really well. You know, I got email that said they were doing 3 times their usual Saturday turnover. But the thing is, you know, regardless of whether or not you are like a big book lover, I think that it's important to realize that bookstores, independent bookstores, are part of the community for many reasons. You know, they host readings, so they host, you know, readings for adults and for children. They are really important to Canadian authors because they are the ones that will feature our books on the, you know, staff favorite shelves. I think that they give us a lot of support, so we need to support them. I think that in this time of a lot of digital and online purchasing, what independent bookstores provide authors and readers is discoverability. You know, I think that when you go online, you get the, if you like this book, then you will love that book. And it's all to do with some sort of an algorithm, you know. But when you go into a bookstore or when you go and talk to your librarian, you can say, this is the way I'm feeling right now. Here's, you know, what have you read that's good? And if you have a good relationship with your bookseller, you can always count on getting a good recommendation. So I think that I think it's important to have that human contact, someone who understands you to make that book recommendation, because life is too short to, you know, read a bad book or one that you don't enjoy. So I hope that everybody supports their independent bookstores. A lot of them now provide online ordering, or I just email mine and they let me know when it's come in, and you can do curbside pickup. And now you can actually go in, just wear your mask, go in, pick up your book, have another little chat with them. It just adds so much to my life, being able to go back into my bookstore again.
Yeah, I agree 100%. There's that human touch just provides something that Amazon and these online sellers will never ever be able to match.
Yeah,
And it's
and I know, and don't be a showroomer. You know what showrooming is? Like,
no,
it means going into a retail store, seeing what you like, and then going and ordering it online. You know, like,
yeah,
don't do that. Get it from your local bookstore.
yeah, I think it's hard for them to compete against these online retailers, and they can use all the support that we can give them. So
Because you'll be sorry. You'll be sorry when that little bookstore is gone. You know?
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're at 8 o'clock, so it doesn't look like we have any more audience questions. So I just want to remind everyone that 2 weeks from today, we'll be having our next speaker, Jeff Rubin. He's wrote the nonfiction book, The Expendables, How the Middle Class Got Screwed by Globalization. He's sort of in the same vein as Gwyn Dyer, who we've hosted in the past. So that's something to look forward to. It'll be on November 12th at 7 p.m. And again, I want to thank Janie so much. It's been so nice to chat with you this evening, and thank you for your time. You've written an amazing book, and I hope everybody, not only if you borrow it from the library and you love it, make sure you can gift it to someone for Christmas or pass on that suggestion so that they can pick it up and enjoy it as well.
Thank you so much to Lethbridge Public Library, Jonathan, and Shar, the wonderful Shar.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shar. She's doing a wonderful job there interpreting for us. So
Yes.
again, thank you and have a wonderful evening, everyone.